The bitter December wind bit at Willow Kensington's cheeks as she stared at the empty horizon where her husband had disappeared 3 days prior, taking their wagon of winter provisions, all their savings, and her trust along with him. At 26, she had never imagined finding herself alone in their remote cabin with winter settling in across the Montana Territory of 1878, with nothing but 2 days' worth of food remaining in her pantry. Willow pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The land around her was beautiful but unforgiving, rolling hills covered in a thin layer of early snow, pine forests standing dark against the whiteness, and mountains looming in the distance. She had loved this view once, when Frank had first brought her here from St. Louis, promising her a life of adventure and prosperity. Now it only reminded her of her isolation. She turned back toward the cabin, a modest structure built of sturdy logs that Frank had constructed with help from neighbors when they'd first settled here 2 years ago. It was a good cabin, solid and well-made, with a stone fireplace that kept the main room warm enough. But without food, without money, it might as well have been a coffin. The reality of her situation struck her anew as she stepped inside and surveyed the nearly bare shelves. A few potatoes, half a sack of flour, some beans, and a bit of salt pork, that was all. Frank had taken everything else, including the hunting rifle. She couldn't even hunt for herself. Willow sank onto a chair by the table, burying her face in her hands. She had trusted Frank completely, ignored the warning signs, his gambling, his drinking, the way his eyes never quite met hers when he talked about their future. She'd been so determined to make their marriage work, to build a life here in this wild country. Now she was paying the price for that blind faith. A sound outside made her head snap up. Hoofbeats. Her heart leaped. Had Frank returned? Had he reconsidered abandoning her? But as quickly as hope flared, it extinguished. Frank wouldn't come back. Whatever had driven him to leave, it had been decisive enough for him to steal from her, to leave her to die. Willow rose and moved to the window, peering out. A stranger on horseback was approaching a tall man on a chestnut stallion. Her first instinct was fear. Lone women in remote cabins were vulnerable, and she had heard enough stories from other settler wives to know the dangers. But desperation outweighed caution. This rider might be her only chance at survival. She grabbed the iron poker from beside the fireplace, her only weapon, and stepped onto the porch. The rider slowed as he approached, raising a hand in greeting. "Hello there, madam," he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the cold air. "Didn't mean to startle you." He pulled his horse to a stop a respectful distance from the cabin. Willow could see him clearly now, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face partially hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were trail-worn but decent, his horse well cared for. He didn't have the desperate look of an outlaw or drifter. "What business do you have here?" Willow called back, keeping the poker visible. "Name's Yates O'Malley," he replied, tipping his hat slightly. "I've been working cattle for the Harper outfit, just finished up for the season. Was heading toward Virginia City when the weather turned. Thought I might ask if you'd spare some water for my horse before I continue on." Willow studied him, trying to decide if he posed a threat. There was something reassuring in his straightforward manner, the way he kept his hands visible and maintained his distance. "The well's around back," she finally said. "You're welcome to water your horse." "Much obliged, madam." He dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback and led his horse around toward the well. Willow remained on the porch, watching him carefully. When he returned, leading his horse, he paused again at a respectful distance. "I don't mean to pry," he said, his eyes taking in the lonely cabin, the absence of stock or supplies visible around the property. "But are you out here alone?" Willow hesitated. Admitting her vulnerability seemed dangerous, but lying seemed pointless. This man could see clearly enough that something was wrong. "My husband left," she said finally, her voice flat. "3 days ago, took our wagon, our provisions, our money." Something flickered across Yates's face, surprise, then anger. "Left you, with winter coming on?" "Yes." The word came out bitter. "Rode away with all our food. I have enough for maybe 2 more days." Yates O'Malley looked at her for a long moment, then at the vast, empty landscape around them, then back at her again. His jaw set with determination. "Then I'll feed you till spring," he said simply, as if it were the most natural decision in the world. Willow stared at him in disbelief. "What? No decent man leaves a woman to starve in the wilderness," he said. His voice was matter-of-fact, but his eyes held a quiet intensity. "I know how to hunt, how to trap. I can help you survive the winter if you'll allow it." "You don't even know me," Willow said, bewildered by his offer. "I know enough," he replied. "I know you need help, and I can provide it." He gestured toward the sky where dark clouds were gathering. "Storm's coming. Looks like it might be a big one. If I leave now, you'll be buried in snow with no food by tomorrow night." Willow hesitated, weighing her options. She could refuse his help and almost certainly starve or freeze to death. Or she could accept the assistance of this stranger, this man who might have his own motives, but who was currently her only hope of survival. "Where would you stay?" she asked cautiously. "I've got a bedroll. I can set up in your barn or build a lean-to nearby," he said. "I won't impose on your home, madam. You have my word." The sincerity in his voice convinced her. Besides, what choice did she really have? "There's a small storage room off the barn," she said finally. "It has a stove. You can stay there." Relief crossed his features. "Thank you. I'll get my horse settled, then see about hunting us something for dinner." As Yates led his horse toward the barn, Willow watched him go, wondering if she had just made a grave mistake or saved her own life. Only time would tell. True to his word, Yates returned an hour later with 2 rabbits. Willow watched from the cabin window as he expertly skinned and cleaned them by the outdoor fire pit, his movements efficient and practiced. When he approached the cabin door, he knocked politely before stepping inside at her invitation. The rabbits had been spitted and were ready for cooking. "Thought you might want to roast these over your hearth," he said. "Easier than trying to cook outside with that wind picking up." "Thank you," Willow said, taking the prepared game from him. The reality of her situation struck her again, accepting food from a stranger because her own husband had left her to die. Yates seemed to sense her discomfort. "I'll head back to the barn, get my things organized," he said. "That storm's blowing in fast. Might be a good idea to bring in extra firewood while we can." "The woodpile's by the side of the cabin," Willow told him. "I'll start cooking these." As he left, Willow set about preparing the rabbits for their meal. Her hands worked automatically while her mind raced. She'd been raised in a respectable family in St. Louis, taught to be a proper lady. Now here she was, abandoned in the wilderness, accepting the help of a cowboy she'd just met. What would her parents think? They had opposed her marriage to Frank from the start, concerned about his character and his plans to move west. She had defended him passionately, convinced their love would overcome any obstacles. How wrong she had been. By the time Yates returned, arms loaded with firewood, Willow had the rabbits cooking over the fire and had set the small table with their meager provisions, the last of the potatoes and some stale bread. "Smells good," he commented, setting the wood in the box beside the hearth. Snow dusted his shoulders and hat, melting quickly in the warmth of the cabin. "It's not much of a meal," Willow said apologetically. "It's more than many have out here," he replied. And tomorrow I'll see about trapping more game. Maybe find a deer if we're lucky." They ate in awkward silence at first, two strangers thrust together by circumstance. Gradually, Willow began asking questions about his work as a cowboy, finding it easier to focus on his life than contemplate her own situation. "Been working cattle since I was 15, Yates told her. "Started out in Texas, worked my way north with the herds. Spent the last few years mostly in Montana and Wyoming territories." "You don't have a permanent home?" Willow asked. Yates shook his head. "Not yet. Been saving up, though. Thought maybe someday I'd get a small spread of my own." He looked around the cabin. "Something like this, actually, just big enough for a man to build a life on." "It's a good cabin," Willow said quietly. "Frank built it well, whatever else he may have done wrong." Yates studied her face for a moment. "How long were you married?" "3 years. We came out here 2 years ago from St. Louis, I thought." She trailed off, not wanting to reveal the depth of her naivety. "You thought you were building a life together," Yates finished for her. "There's no shame in that, Mrs. Kensington," she supplied. "Willow Kensington." "And yes, that's what I thought." "Well, Mrs. Kensington, please," she interrupted. "Just Willow. It seems strange to stand on formality in these circumstances." He nodded. "Willow, then, and I'm Yates." He set down his fork. "I meant what I said earlier. I'll help you through the winter. Come spring, you'll have options. You could return to your family in St. Louis, or—" "I can't go back," she said quickly. "My parents warned me against marrying Frank. They said he wasn't reliable, that I'd regret following him west." She laughed bitterly. "I told them they didn't understand what love was. I couldn't face them now, admit they were right all along." "Then we'll figure something else out," Yates said simply. "But first, we need to get through winter." After dinner, he insisted on washing the dishes, saying she'd done the cooking. As Willow watched him work, she was struck by how different he was from Frank. Where Frank had been charming but restless, always talking about the next opportunity, the next big strike, Yates had a steady, grounded quality. His hands were calloused and strong, his movements deliberate. "The storm's going to be bad," he said, looking out the window at the increasing snowfall. "I should check on my horse, make sure everything's secure in the barn." "Be careful," Willow found herself saying. "The path to the barn can be treacherous in the snow." He nodded, putting on his coat and hat. "I won't be long. Bank up the fire before you turn in." After he left, Willow stood by the window watching the snow fall in thick, silent curtains. The reality of her situation was sinking in. Without Yates's unexpected appearance, she would likely have died in this cabin, alone and forgotten. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter cold. She added wood to the fire as he'd suggested, then prepared for bed. The cabin had only one bedroom, and as she settled under the quilts, she found herself grateful for Yates's insistence on staying in the barn. Many men might have used her vulnerable position to impose themselves, but he had shown nothing but respect. As she drifted toward sleep, the wind howling outside, Willow realized something strange for the first time since Frank had abandoned her. She felt safe. The next morning, Willow awoke to a world transformed by snow. It had fallen heavily through the night, blanketing everything in pristine white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystal-clear blue sky and temperatures that made the snow crunch underfoot. She had just stoked the fire when a knock came at the door. Yates stood there, his breath visible in the cold air, holding a brace of snowshoe hares. "Morning," he greeted her. "Caught these in traps I set last night after you turned in." "You set traps in that storm?" Willow asked, amazed. "Best time," he replied with a slight smile. "Animals are rushing to find shelter, not paying as much attention to danger." He handed her the hares. "I've already cleaned them. Thought we could make a stew that would last a couple of days." "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "You must be freezing." Inside, he removed his hat and coat, revealing dark hair streaked with a touch of silver at the temples. In the daylight, Willow could see him more clearly. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested both laughter and hardship. "I checked your woodpile," he said. "It's decent, but won't last all winter. When the weather clears a bit more, I'll cut some additional cords." "Thank you," Willow said, genuinely grateful. She set about preparing breakfast from their meager stores, a thin porridge with the last of the dried apples chopped into it. As they ate, Yates outlined his plans. "After breakfast, I'll set more traps, then see about finding deer sign. We'll need larger game to see us through winter. Do you have any preserves put up? Vegetables from a garden?" Willow's face fell. "We had a root cellar full of preserved vegetables, dried fruits, jams." Frank took almost everything. "There's still some pickled beans and a few jars of preserves, but not nearly enough for winter." Yates frowned. "Your husband was thorough in his betrayal. He always was meticulous," Willow said with bitter irony. "Do you think we can really survive the winter?" "Yes," Yates said without hesitation. "It won't be easy, but it's possible. Game is plentiful in these parts if you know where to look, and we still have time before the worst of winter sets in to gather and preserve what we can." His confidence reassured her. After breakfast, they worked together to start the hare stew, setting it to simmer slowly over the fire. Then Yates departed with his rifle to hunt, leaving Willow to tend the cabin. Alone again, she took stock of their situation. The reality of spending an entire winter in close quarters with a man she barely knew struck her anew. It was highly improper by the standards she'd been raised with, but those standards meant little in the face of survival. Still, she wondered what the neighbors would think, the nearest being the Hendersons, 5 miles east. Would they assume the worst about her character? Would rumors spread? She pushed these thoughts aside. The neighbor's opinion mattered little compared to staying alive. Besides, the heavy snow would keep most people isolated in their own homesteads for weeks at a time. By spring, she would have decided her next steps. Willow spent the day taking inventory of what little remained in the cabin. In addition to the food Frank had left behind, she found a few items he had overlooked: a small sack of coffee beans hidden at the back of a shelf, a jar of honey she had tucked away for special occasions, and a few packets of seeds she had been saving for next year's garden. Not much, but each discovery felt like a small victory. By late afternoon, the light was beginning to fade when she heard Yates returning. She opened the door to find him dragging a small deer across the snow. "You did it," she exclaimed, genuinely impressed. "Got lucky," he said, though his pleased expression belied his modest words. "Found it in a sheltered valley not 2 miles from here. This will give us a good start on our winter stores." Together, they hung the deer from a sturdy tree branch near the cabin. Yates showed her how to properly field dress the animal to preserve the meat in the cold weather. "We'll butcher it properly tomorrow," he explained. "The cold will keep it preserved overnight, and this way the blood drains completely." That evening, they shared the rabbit stew by the fire, the cabin cozy despite the frigid temperatures outside. The meal was simple but nourishing, and for the first time in days, Willow felt the gnawing fear in her stomach begin to recede. "Tell me about yourself," Yates said as they sat by the fire after dinner. "How did a woman from St. Louis end up in this remote cabin?" Willow sighed, gazing into the flames. "I met Frank at a social gathering. He was handsome, charming, full of grand plans and adventures. My life in St. Louis felt confined, predetermined. Every day the same routines, the same expectations." She glanced at Yates. "I wanted more than that. And Frank promised you more." "Yes, He talked about the West like it was Eden, untamed land waiting for people with vision and courage. He'd worked briefly in the mining camps in Colorado and was convinced he could strike it rich out here. She laughed softly. I was so naive. I imagined us building a grand ranch, hosting parties for neighbors, creating a civilized outpost in the wilderness. Instead, you got this, Yates said, gesturing to the modest cabin. This cabin isn't what disappointed me, Willow corrected him. This I could have been happy with if it had been shared with someone who truly cared for me. It was realizing that Frank saw me as just another possession, something he could discard when it became inconvenient. Yates was quiet for a moment. Some men aren't worthy of the women who love them, he said finally. And what about you? Willow asked, curious about this man who had appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer. Have you ever been married? A shadow crossed his face. No, came close once back in Texas. Her name was Catherine. We were young, had plans to start a ranch together. He poked at the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. She died of fever before we could marry. After that, I took to the trail. Easier to keep moving than to stay in one place with those memories. I'm sorry, Willow said softly, understanding now the hint of sadness she sometimes saw in his eyes. It was a long time ago, he replied. Almost 10 years now. They sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire crackled between them. Tomorrow I'll show you how to set traps yourself, Yates said eventually, and how to use my pistol. You should be able to defend yourself if necessary. Willow nodded, grateful for his practicality. I'd like that. I don't want to be helpless again. As the days passed, a routine began to establish itself. Yates would hunt or check traps in the mornings, while Willow maintained the cabin and prepared meals. In the afternoons, he taught her survival skills, how to set snares for rabbits, how to identify animal tracks in the snow, how to shoot his revolver with reasonable accuracy. A week after his arrival, they were blessed with a spell of milder weather. Yates used the opportunity to cut additional firewood, working from sunrise to sunset to build up their supplies. Willow helped where she could, stacking the split logs along the side of the cabin. By the time darkness fell, they were both exhausted but satisfied with their progress. The woodpile had tripled in size, and Yates had also managed to shoot 2 more deer, the meat from which they were carefully preserving through a combination of smoking, drying, and storing in the frigid natural refrigerator of the root cellar. That evening, as they sat down to a dinner of venison stew, Willow realized she was no longer afraid of starving. In just a week, Yates had transformed their prospects from desperate to hopeful. We're going to make it, aren't we? She said, the realization bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. Yates looked up from his bowl, surprise crossing his features. Yes, we are, he confirmed. Was there ever any doubt? Every moment from the time Frank rode away until you appeared, Willow admitted. I truly thought I was going to die here alone. Yates reached across the table, hesitating briefly before placing his hand over hers. His palm was warm and rough with calluses. You're not alone anymore, Willow. The simple touch, the sincerity in his voice, stirred something in her, something she had thought died when Frank betrayed her. She quickly pulled her hand away, confused by her reaction. Thank you for all you've done, she said, standing to clear the dishes. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. No need for repayment, Yates said, rising to help her. Any decent man would have done the same. But as they moved around the small cabin, working together to clean up after dinner, Willow wasn't so sure. She had known plenty of decent men in St. Louis who would have ridden past her cabin without a second thought. What Yates was doing went beyond common decency. It was a profound act of kindness toward a stranger. That night, Lying in her bed listening to the wind outside, Willow found herself thinking about Yates in a way that both surprised and unsettled her. It had been only a week since they met, only a week since Frank's betrayal. She shouldn't be feeling this curious warmth when Yates smiled at her, this flutter when their hands accidentally touched while working. She told herself it was merely gratitude, merely the natural response to being saved from certain death. But deep down, Willow knew it was something more, and that realization frightened her almost as much as the prospect of starving had. As December deepened, the weather grew increasingly harsh. Blizzards swept down from the mountains, sometimes confining them to the cabin for days at a time. During these periods of forced proximity, Willow learned more about Yates, how he'd left home at 15 after his father died, how he'd worked his way up from camp cook to respected cowhand, how he dreamed of someday having his own small cattle operation. He was a good storyteller, painting vivid pictures of cattle drives through Texas, of nights spent beneath star-filled skies, of the camaraderie of cowboys around a campfire. But he was an even better listener, drawing out Willow's own stories of her childhood in St. Louis, her love of books, her secret desire to one day see the ocean. One evening, as a particularly violent storm raged outside, Yates produced a worn deck of cards from his coat pocket. "Thought we might need some entertainment," he said with a slight smile. "Know how to play poker?" Willow laughed. "My father would be scandalized if he knew, but yes. My brother taught me when we were children." They played for hours, using buttons as chips, their laughter filling the cabin as Willow revealed herself to be a formidable opponent. When she won a particularly large pot after bluffing Yates into folding, his look of surprised respect made her heart skip a beat. "You're full of surprises, Willow Kensington," he said, shaking his head in admiration. "A woman needs to keep some mysteries," she replied with a smile, collecting her winnings. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, something electric passed between them. Then Yates cleared his throat and began gathering the cards. "It's getting late," he said. "I should head back to the barn." Willow watched him button his coat and wrap his scarf tightly before venturing out into the storm, the door closing firmly behind him. Left alone, she pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks, trying to calm the rapid beating of her heart. This was dangerous territory. She had rushed headlong into love once before and paid dearly for it. Yet the feelings growing for Yates seemed entirely different from what she had felt for Frank. With Frank, there had been excitement, passion, a breathless quality that in hindsight seemed more like infatuation than love. With Yates, there was a steadiness, a deepening appreciation, a trust that grew with each passing day. But she couldn't act on these feelings, not yet, perhaps not ever. For all she knew, Yates saw her only as someone in need of help, a responsibility he had shouldered out of decency rather than any personal interest. Besides, she was still technically married, though she had no idea where Frank might be or if she would ever see him again. The next morning, Willow awoke to find the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed into a glittering wonderland. The sun shone on pristine snow that covered everything in sight, and icicles hung from the eaves like crystal daggers. She had just finished stoking the fire when a knock came at the door. Yates stood there with his arms full of firewood, snow dusting his shoulders. "Morning," he greeted her, stamping his boots before entering. "Thought I'd bring in more wood before checking the traps." "Thank you," Willow said, taking some of the wood from him. Their fingers brushed, and she quickly pulled away, busying herself with arranging the logs in the woodbox. Yates seemed to sense her discomfort. "I'll be back before noon," he said after depositing the rest of the wood. "If the weather holds, might be good to smoke some more of that venison today." After he left, Willow set about her morning chores with unusual vigor, as if physical activity could drive away her confusing thoughts. She scrubbed the floors, aired out bedding, and reorganized their food stores, calculating how long their provisions would last. By the time Yates returned with 2 rabbits from the traps, she had the cabin spotless and a pot of coffee brewing on the stove. "Place looks nice," he commented, hanging his coat by the door. "I needed to keep busy," she admitted, pouring him a cup of coffee. "Sometimes I feel useless compared to all you're doing." "Useless?" Yates looked genuinely surprised. "Willow, you're working just as hard as I am." "Different tasks, maybe, but just as important." His words warmed her. Frank had never acknowledged her contributions to their household, treating her work as expected and unremarkable. They spent the afternoon smoking meat, working side by side in comfortable companionship. Yates had constructed a simple smoking rack near the cabin, and he showed Willow how to properly prepare the meat and maintain the right kind of smoldering fire underneath. "My father taught me this," he explained as they worked. "Said a man should know how to preserve food if he wants to survive in this country." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Yates agreed. "Tough but fair. Taught me everything important I know: how to work hard, how to treat people right, how to survive." He paused, turning a piece of meat on the rack. "He would have liked you." "Why do you say that?" Willow asked, curious. "Because you're strong," Yates said simply. "When I rode up to this cabin and found you standing there with that poker in your hand, ready to defend yourself despite everything. That took courage. My father always said courage was the quality he respected most in people." Willow hadn't thought of herself as courageous. Desperate, certainly. Afraid, absolutely. But not brave. "I don't feel brave most of the time," she admitted. "That's often how it works," Yates said with a small smile. "The bravest people I've known never thought they were doing anything special. They just did what needed doing, even when they were scared." His words stayed with Willow throughout the evening and into the night. Perhaps there was a kind of courage in simply continuing, in facing each day despite uncertainty and fear. If so, then maybe she was braver than she'd realized. As Christmas approached, the weather settled into a pattern of clear, bitterly cold days and long nights. Their routine continued: Yates hunting and trapping, Willow maintaining their home and preparing meals. Their food stores had grown to a point where Willow no longer feared starvation, and they had developed a comfortable companionship that made the isolated days pass more easily. 3 days before Christmas, Willow was surprised when Yates returned from checking his trap line with something bulky concealed beneath his coat. "Close your eyes," he instructed as he entered the cabin. Puzzled but curious, Willow complied. She heard him set something on the table, then his footsteps as he moved around the room. "All right, you can look now," he said after a moment. Willow opened her eyes to find a small pine tree standing in a bucket near the fireplace. On the table lay a bundle of pine cones, red berries, and strips of colored cloth. "I thought we could use some Christmas cheer," Yates explained, suddenly looking uncertain. "If you want to, that is." Emotion welled up in Willow's throat. The simple thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her deeply. Frank had never bothered with Christmas decorations, calling them a waste of time and effort. "It's perfect," she managed to say. "Thank you." Together they decorated the little tree with the pine cones and berries, and Willow cut the colored cloth into strips that they tied into bows. The result was rustic but charming, a bright spot of festivity in their otherwise practical surroundings. As they stood back to admire their work, Willow impulsively reached for Yates's hand, squeezing it in gratitude. To her surprise, he didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers curled around hers, warm and strong. "Merry Christmas, Willow," he said softly. "Merry Christmas, Yates," she replied, her voice equally quiet. For a moment they stood there, connected by their joined hands and something deeper that neither was ready to name. Then Yates gently released her hand and moved toward the door. "Almost forgot brought back a couple of grouse as well," he said, retrieving the birds from where he'd hung them outside. "Thought they might make a nice Christmas dinner." The moment had passed, but something had shifted between them. As they went about preparing the birds, Willow found herself stealing glances at Yates, noting the careful precision of his movements, the way the firelight caught in his dark hair, the quiet concentration in his eyes. That night, after Yates had returned to the barn, Willow stood looking at the little Christmas tree, its silhouette visible in the dying firelight. In the midst of hardship and uncertainty, Yates had found a way to bring beauty and joy into their lives. It was a quality Frank had never possessed the ability to find light even in darkness. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, the sun turning the snow-covered landscape into a sea of diamonds. Willow rose early, determined to make the day special despite their limited resources. She baked bread using some of their precious flour and prepared the grouse with herbs she had dried before winter set in. When Yates arrived at the cabin mid-morning, he carried a small package wrapped in a piece of buckskin. "Merry Christmas," he said, holding it out to her somewhat sheepishly. "You didn't have to get me anything," Willow protested, though she was deeply touched. "It's nothing much," he assured her. "Just something I made." Curious, Willow unwrapped the package to find a delicately carved wooden hairpin. The design was simple but beautiful, a small flower with carefully rendered petals. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her finger over the smooth wood. "Did you really make this?" Yates nodded, looking pleased by her reaction. "Spent evenings working on it. My father taught me woodcarving when I was a boy." "I love it," Willow said sincerely. She reached up and secured her hair with the pin, feeling a rush of pleasure at wearing something he had created specifically for her. "I have something for you too," she said, retrieving a package from behind the stove. "It's not much either." Yates unwrapped the gift to find a knitted scarf. The wool was uneven in places, showing Willow's inexperience, but the deep blue color complemented his eyes. "You made this?" he asked, looking genuinely impressed. "Yes," Willow admitted. "I unraveled one of my old shawls I never wear. I'm not very skilled at knitting, I'm afraid." "It's perfect," Yates said, immediately wrapping it around his neck. "No one's made me a gift like this since my mother died." His voice held a note of quiet wonder that made Willow's heart ache. Their Christmas dinner was simple by the standards of Willow's upbringing in St. Louis, but it was one of the most meaningful meals she had ever shared. They ate by candlelight, the little pine tree glowing in the corner, and talked of Christmases past and hopes for the future. After dinner, as they sat by the fire sipping coffee sweetened with the last of Willow's honey, Yates surprised her by saying, "I've been thinking about what happens when spring comes." Willow's heart sank a little. Of course he had been thinking of moving on once winter ended. Why would he stay? "I understand," she said carefully. "You've already done more than enough. When the trail's clear, you'll want to continue your journey." "That's not what I meant," Yates said, setting down his cup and looking directly at her. "I've been thinking about what happens to you when spring comes." "Oh." Willow hadn't allowed herself to think too far ahead, focusing instead on surviving one day at a time. "You have options," Yates continued. "You could try to make a go of this place on your own, though that would be difficult. You could sell it and return to St. Louis or try one of the growing towns in the territory." He hesitated. "Or you could come with me." Willow's breath caught. "Come with you." "I've saved almost enough for a small stake," Yates explained. "Not far from here, there's a valley I've had my eye on, good grazing land, sheltered from the worst of the winter storms with a creek running through it. I thought maybe we could build something there, together." The implication of his words hung in the air between them. "Yates," Willow said slowly, "are you asking what I think you're asking?" He met her gaze steadily. "I know it's too soon. I know you're still legally married and you've had no time to properly grieve what was lost. I'm not asking for an answer now. Just asking you to consider the possibility of a future. With me." Willow's mind whirled. The practical obstacles were significant: her marriage to Frank, the scandal that would ensue if she simply began living with another man, the uncertainty of starting over yet again. But beneath these concerns, a small flame of hope had kindled. "I need time," she said finally. "You have it," Yates assured her. "All winter to decide. No pressure, no expectations." The days after Christmas passed in a curious blend of normality and heightened awareness. They continued their daily routines, but now each interaction seemed charged with unspoken possibility. Willow found herself noticing details about Yates she had overlooked before: the gentle way he handled injured wildlife, the deep rumble of his laugh when something genuinely amused him, the thoughtful expression he wore when gazing at distant mountains. New Year's Eve arrived with another storm, this one less violent but persistent, wrapping the cabin in swirling curtains of snow. Yates had come in earlier than usual, concerned about deteriorating visibility, and they had spent the afternoon playing cards and talking beside the fire. As evening fell, Willow produced the last of a bottle of whiskey Frank had left behind. "I thought we might toast the new year," she suggested. "Put the old one behind us." Yates raised an eyebrow. "Didn't take you for a drinking woman." "I'm not usually," Willow admitted. "But tonight feels like an occasion for something special." They sipped the fiery liquid as midnight approached, sharing stories and occasional comfortable silences. Willow found herself talking about her childhood dreams, things she had never told Frank. "I always wanted to write," she confessed. "Stories, mostly. Tales of adventure and romance that I'd never experienced myself." "You should do it," Yates said simply. "You tell stories beautifully." "Maybe someday," Willow replied, warmed by his encouragement. "What about you? Did you achieve your childhood dreams?" Yates considered the question. "Some of them. I wanted to see the country, and I have. Wanted to work with horses, and I do." He swirled the amber liquid in his cup. "But the bigger dreams land of my own, a family, those are still waiting." The clock Willow had brought from St. Louis chimed midnight, its delicate sound nearly lost beneath the howl of the wind. "Happy New Year, Willow," Yates said, raising his cup. "Happy New Year, Yates," she replied, touching her cup to his. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," he echoed, his eyes never leaving hers as they drank. In that moment, with the storm raging outside and warmth surrounding them within, Willow felt something shift inside her, a letting go of past hurts, an opening to future possibilities. She wasn't ready to give Yates an answer about spring, not yet. But for the first time, she could genuinely envision a life beyond the pain of Frank's betrayal. The weeks of January passed in a blur of snow and cold. The winter proved to be one of the harshest in memory, with temperatures dropping so low that the sap froze in the trees, creating eerie cracking sounds in the forest at night. But inside the cabin, Willow and Yates created a warm haven of safety and increasingly comfortable companionship. Yates continued to sleep in the barn's storage room, maintaining the propriety that both of them tacitly acknowledged was important. But he spent his days with Willow, teaching her more survival skills, playing cards or checkers in the evenings and sharing stories of their lives. One particularly bitter night in late January, Willow was awakened by the sound of the cabin door opening. Startled, she sat up in bed, clutching the quilt to her chest. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. "It's just me," came Yates's familiar voice. "Sorry to disturb you." The stove in the barn room gave out chimneys blocked with ice. "It's 20 below out there." Relief flooded through Willow. "Come in, get warm," she called, rising to stoke the fire in the main room. Yates entered, stamping snow from his boots. His face was alarmingly pale, his lips tinged blue with cold. "You're half frozen," Willow exclaimed, guiding him to the chair nearest the fire. "How long were you trying to fix that stove?" "Too long, probably," Yates admitted through chattering teeth. "Didn't want to disturb you." "You could have frozen to death," Willow scolded, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. "That would have disturbed me considerably more." She built up the fire and made coffee, forcing Yates to drink the hot liquid while she assessed the situation. The storm outside was intensifying, and temperatures were continuing to drop. The barn room would be uninhabitable without a functioning stove. "You'll have to stay here tonight," she decided. "You can take the bedroll by the fire." "I don't want to impose," Yates began. "It's not an imposition if it prevents you from freezing to death," Willow cut him off. "Besides, who's to know out here? We'll fix the stove tomorrow when it's light." Reluctantly, Yates agreed, and Willow helped him arrange a makeshift bed near the hearth. Despite the innocence of the arrangement, there was an undeniable intimacy in preparing for sleep in the same small space. Willow found herself acutely aware of Yates's presence as she returned to her own bed, leaving the bedroom door slightly ajar in case he needed anything during the night. Sleep was slow to return as she listened to the storm outside and the occasional shifting of Yates by the fire. There was comfort in knowing he was there, in not being alone during the fiercest night of winter. But there was also a yearning that surprised her with its intensity, a wish that circumstances were different, that there weren't so many complications standing between them. In the morning, Willow awoke to find Yates already up, stoking the fire and preparing coffee. He looked up when she emerged from the bedroom, wrapped in her robe. "Morning," he said, a touch of awkwardness in his voice. "Storm's let up some. I'll head out to fix that stove as soon as it's fully light." "No rush," Willow said, pouring herself coffee. "It's safe and warm in here." They worked together to prepare a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with the last of the honey. As they ate, Yates seemed preoccupied, his gaze frequently drifting to the window. "Something troubling you?" Willow finally asked. Yates hesitated. "Just thinking about how precarious life is out here. If I hadn't woken when that stove failed, if the cabin had been empty when I arrived months ago." He looked at her directly. "We survive by the smallest of margins sometimes. But we do survive," Willow pointed out. "Especially when we're not alone." His expression softened. "Yes, especially then." After breakfast, true to his word, Yates headed out to repair the stove in the barn room. Willow watched from the window as he made his way through the deep snow, strong and capable against the harsh landscape. She found herself hoping the repair would be complicated, requiring another night by her hearth, and immediately chided herself for the thought. But the stove was fixed by midday, and that evening Yates returned to his separate quarters, leaving the cabin feeling strangely empty despite its small size. February brought slightly milder weather, with occasional days warm enough to melt the snow on south-facing slopes before freezing again at night. On one such day, Yates suggested they ride out together to check the trap line, giving Willow a chance to escape the confines of the cabin. "Are you sure it's safe?" Willow asked, eyeing the horse Yates had saddled for her, his own chestnut stallion. He would ride Frank's old mare, which had remained in the barn when Frank left. "The trail's packed down from my daily trips, and Phoenix here is sure-footed," Yates assured her, helping her mount. "Besides, you've been cooped up for months. Thought you might enjoy the fresh air." The day was glorious, bright sunshine sparkling on the snow, the air cold but invigorating. As they rode side by side along the forest trail, Willow felt a freedom she hadn't experienced since before Frank's departure. Being on horseback, moving through the winter landscape with Yates beside her, awakened a sense of possibility she had almost forgotten. The trapline yielded 2 rabbits and a fox with a luxurious red coat. Yates showed Willow how to properly remove the pelt, explaining that good fur could fetch a decent price in spring trading. "You think like a true frontiersman," Willow observed as they worked. "Always planning ahead, always finding value in what others might overlook." "Had to learn young," Yates replied. "When you grow up with little, you learn to make use of everything." On their return journey, they stopped at a viewpoint overlooking the valley. The vista was breathtaking, miles of snow-covered forest stretching toward distant mountains, broken by the occasional glint of frozen streams. "It's beautiful," Willow breathed, taking in the wild grandeur. "This is what I love about this country," Yates said, his gaze sweeping the landscape. "It's harsh but honest. Demands your respect but rewards your effort." As they sat their horses side by side, enjoying the view, Willow realized with sudden clarity that she had fallen in love with Yates O'Malley. Not the desperate, clinging love she had felt for Frank, but something deeper and more substantial, a love built on shared hardship, mutual respect, and genuine admiration. The realization should have frightened her, given all the uncertainties of their situation. Instead, it settled in her heart like a certainty, something she had perhaps known for weeks but hadn't been ready to acknowledge. Yates turned to find her watching him, and something in her expression made him draw his horse closer to hers. "Willow," he said softly, questioningly. Instead of answering, she leaned across the short distance between them and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was brief but unmistakable in its meaning. When she pulled back, Yates looked stunned, his eyes searching hers. "I'm sorry," Willow said quickly. "I shouldn't have." "Don't apologize," Yates interrupted. He reached across to take her gloved hand in his. "Never apologize for that." The ride back to the cabin was charged with unspoken emotions, both of them acutely aware that something fundamental had changed between them. When they reached the cabin, Yates helped Willow dismount, his hands lingering at her waist longer than necessary. "I should take care of the horses," he said, his voice rough. Willow nodded, suddenly shy. "I'll start dinner." Inside the cabin, she moved about her tasks in a daze, replaying the kiss in her mind. It had been impulsive, perhaps reckless given all the complications, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. For months she had been drifting, her future uncertain after Frank's betrayal. Now, for the first time, she felt anchored again, not to a place, but to a person. When Yates returned, they ate dinner with an undercurrent of tension that was both uncomfortable and exhilarating. Their conversation was stilted at first, neither quite knowing how to address what had happened. Finally, as they sat by the fire after the meal, Yates broke the silence. "We should talk about what happened today." "Yes," Willow agreed, gathering her courage. "I kissed you, and I don't regret it, but I understand if you think it was inappropriate given everything." "Inappropriate is the last word I'd use," Yates said, his voice low and earnest. "I've wanted to kiss you for weeks, but I've held back because of your situation, because I didn't want you to feel pressured or rushed." "I don't feel pressured," Willow assured him. "What I feel is alive again." "You've given me that, Yates, not just by saving my life, but by showing me what a true partnership could be." "What about Frank?" Yates asked, the question that had hung between them for months. Willow sighed. "Legally, I'm still his wife. But in every way that matters. That marriage ended the moment he rode away with our food, leaving me to die." She met Yates's gaze directly. I don't know where he is or if I'll ever be able to obtain a legal divorce. All I know is that I can't let him control my future any more than he already has my past." Yates nodded slowly. "I understand that, but I need you to be certain, Willow. I'm not asking for promises, yet spring is still weeks away and you'll have choices then. But I need to know that this isn't just gratitude or loneliness speaking." "It's neither," Willow said firmly. "What I feel for you has grown day by day, through watching you work, listening to your stories, seeing how you face challenges with courage and kindness. It's real, Yates. More real than what I thought was love before." The firelight played across his features as he absorbed her words. Then he rose from his chair and crossed to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "I love you, Willow Kensington," he said simply. "I didn't ride to your cabin looking for love, but I found it anyway. And whatever happens when spring comes, whatever obstacles we face, I want you to know that." Tears pricked Willow's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I wasn't looking for it either, but here we are." Yates reached up to cup her face gently, then leaned in to kiss her. Unlike their first kiss, which had been brief and impulsive, this one lingered, deepening as Willow's arms wound around his neck. When they finally parted, both breathless, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "If I stay." Willow understood. Despite their feelings, despite the isolation that meant no one would ever know, they both wanted to proceed with honor. "When spring comes," she said softly, "when we've figured out what's possible legally, then." "Then," Yates agreed, the single word a promise of future possibilities. He rose reluctantly and retrieved his coat. At the door, he turned back. "Sleep well, Willow." "You too, Yates," she replied, watching him disappear into the night. As winter began to loosen its grip in early March, subtle changes signaled the approaching spring. The days grew longer, the sun stronger, and occasionally a warm breeze would blow, carrying the promise of renewal. Willow and Yates settled into a new rhythm, their acknowledged feelings bringing both joy and a sweet tension to their daily interactions. They were careful to maintain propriety. Yates still slept in the barn room, and they limited physical contact to brief touches and occasional kisses. But their conversations grew deeper, more future-oriented as they began to seriously discuss what might be possible when spring fully arrived. "I've been thinking," Yates said one evening as they sat by the fire, "about how to handle the Frank situation." Willow looked up from her mending. "What do you mean?" "When the trail's clear enough for travel, I could ride to Helena. The territorial courts there might be able to advise on your legal options. Abandonment is grounds for divorce in most places, especially when it involves leaving a spouse in life-threatening circumstances." "Do you think it would be that simple?" Willow asked, hope and skepticism warring in her voice. "Not simple necessarily," Yates admitted, "but possible. Especially if we can find witnesses who saw Frank leaving with your provisions. The Hendersons might have seen him pass their place." Willow considered this. The prospect of a legal divorce, of freedom to build a new life with Yates, was tantalizing, but the process would involve public scrutiny, possibly scandal. "People will talk," she said quietly. "They always do," Yates replied with a shrug. "But out here, folks generally mind their own business more than back east, and those who matter, those who know what kind of man Frank really was, they'll understand." The conversation was interrupted by an unexpected sound, the distant jingle of harness bells. Both of them froze, listening intently. After months of isolation, the sound of approach was startling. "Someone's coming," Yates said, moving to the window. Wagon or sled by the sound, Willow joined him, peering out into the twilight. Through the trees, they could make out the shape of a horse-drawn sled making its way along the snow-packed trail toward the cabin. "The Hendersons," Willow guessed. Their nearest neighbors sometimes traveled by sled in winter, though they rarely ventured this far. "Could be," Yates said, reaching for his coat. "I'll go meet them." Willow watched from the doorway as Yates walked out to greet the approaching visitors. The sled came into clearer view, a sturdy conveyance with two figures bundled against the cold. As it drew closer, Willow recognized Margaret Henderson's distinctive red scarf. Beside her sat her husband, Thomas, handling the reins. Relief flooded through Willow. The Hendersons were good people, hard-working settlers who had been kind to her and Frank when they first arrived in the area. If anyone had to discover her unusual living arrangement with Yates, the Hendersons were perhaps the safest possibility. Yates exchanged greetings with the couple, then gestured toward the cabin. Willow stepped back inside to prepare for guests, the first they'd had all winter. She quickly tidied the main room, put coffee on to boil, and arranged some smoked venison and bread on a plate when the Hendersons entered, stamping snow from their boots. Their faces showed surprise at finding Willow not alone. "Mrs. Kensington," Margaret said, embracing Willow warmly. "We've been so worried about you. When we heard Frank had left," she trailed off, glancing uncertainly at Yates. "It's true," Willow confirmed. "Frank left in December, took almost all our provisions with him." Thomas Henderson's face darkened. "We saw him pass our place heading east. Had the wagon loaded up. Asked him where you were, and he said you were staying with relatives who'd come to visit. Never sat right with me, that story. I would have frozen or starved if not for Mr. O'Malley," Willow explained, gesturing to Yates. "He arrived just after Frank left, found me alone with almost no food." "The Lord provides," Margaret said, looking at Yates with newfound appreciation, "even if sometimes his instruments are unexpected." Yates nodded respectfully to the older woman. "I was just passing through, madam." Couldn't leave her to face winter alone. Over coffee and food, they exchanged news. The Hendersons had been relatively isolated as well, but had heard rumors from the occasional traveler. The winter had been harsh throughout the territory, with several homesteaders lost to cold or hunger. There were also rumors of Frank Kensington. He had been seen in Virginia City, apparently flush with money and spinning tales of a sick wife back home. This last bit of information struck Willow like a physical blow. While she had suspected Frank had no intention of returning, hearing confirmation of his new life elsewhere made his betrayal freshly painful. "I'm sorry, Willow," Margaret said gently, seeing her distress. "You deserved better than that scoundrel." "I'm just glad you weren't alone out here," Thomas added, glancing at Yates with tacit understanding in his eyes. The older man had clearly assessed the situation and made his own judgments. When the Hendersons prepared to leave, promising to return when weather permitted, Margaret pulled Willow aside for a private word. "I see how he looks at you," she said quietly, nodding toward Yates, who was helping Thomas with the sled. "And how you look at him." Willow flushed. "Margaret, no need to explain," the older woman interrupted. "Life out here isn't like back east. Sometimes Providence sends the right person at the unexpected time." She squeezed Willow's hand. "Frank forfeited any claim to your loyalty when he left you to die, legal papers or no." The Hendersons' visit, brief as it was, marked a turning point. They had brought news of the outside world, confirming Frank's abandonment and tacitly accepting Willow and Yates's arrangement. More importantly, they had offered a kind of blessing that eased some of Willow's lingering concerns about propriety and reputation. That evening, after the Hendersons had departed, Willow and Yates sat close together by the fire, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. "That went better than I expected," Yates admitted. "They're good people. The best," Willow agreed. "What Thomas said about Frank being in Virginia City, it makes everything more real somehow. He truly has started a new life without a backward glance. Are you all right? Yates asked, studying her face in the firelight. Strangely, yes, Willow realized. A few months ago, that news would have devastated me. Now it feels like confirmation that I'm free to move forward too. Yates kissed her forehead gently. When the trail's clear enough, we'll ride to Helena. Get legal advice. Do this properly. And then? Willow asked, looking up at him. And then, he said, his voice low and certain, I'm going to ask you to marry me, Willow Kensington. Properly, officially, in front of witnesses and God. Her heart swelled with joy at the simple, definitive statement. I'll say yes, she told him, reaching up to touch his face. I'll say yes, Yates O'Malley. As March progressed, the signs of spring became more pronounced. Snow began melting in earnest, revealing patches of earth that had been hidden for months. Birdsong returned to the forest, and the creek behind the cabin broke free of ice, gurgling with renewed energy. With the changing season came increased activity. Yates repaired winter damage to the cabin and outbuildings, while Willow planted an early garden in the newly thawed soil. Their food stores, carefully managed throughout winter, would easily sustain them until fresh vegetables could be harvested. The first travelers began appearing on the trail that ran near the cabin traders, settlers returning to homesteads they had abandoned during the harsh winter, occasional soldiers from the fort 30 miles north. Each brought news and gossip, including more confirmed sightings of Frank in Virginia City, where he had apparently taken up with a saloon girl and was rapidly gambling away the money from selling Willow's possessions. By early April, the main trails were clear enough for longer travel. One bright morning, Yates announced it was time for their trip to Helena. We can make it in 3 days if the weather holds, he said as they prepared for the journey. I've sent word ahead to a lawyer I know they're honest man who might be able to help with your situation. The prospect of leaving the cabin after months of isolation filled Willow with both excitement and trepidation. The cabin had become a sanctuary, a place where she and Yates had built something precious together. Venturing into the outside world meant facing scrutiny, explaining their relationship, confronting the legal complications of her marriage to Frank. They departed at dawn, riding side by side along trails still muddy from melting snow. Yates had insisted Willow keep Phoenix, his chestnut stallion, saying the sure-footed horse would serve her better on the journey. He rode Frank's old mare, which responded well to his gentle handling. The journey to Helena was an adventure in itself. They camped under stars brighter than Willow had ever seen, shared meals beside small campfires, and talked endlessly about their hopes for the future. Despite the serious purpose of their trip, there was a freedom in being on the trail together, away from the confines of the cabin and the memories it held. Helena surprised Willow with its bustle and growth. Though still a frontier town at heart, it had developed significantly since she had passed through it on her way to the homestead with Frank 3 years earlier. Buildings that had been hastily constructed wooden affairs were now substantial structures of brick and stone. The streets teemed with people from all walks of life: miners, businessmen, settlers, and soldiers from the nearby fort. Yates secured them separate rooms at a respectable hotel, maintaining the propriety they both felt was important until their situation could be legally resolved. The following morning, they met with Mr. Hargrove, the lawyer Yates had contacted. Hargrove's office was a small but well-appointed room above a dry goods store. The lawyer himself was a surprisingly young man with spectacles and a thoughtful demeanor. Mrs. Kensington, he greeted Willow, gesturing to a chair. Mr. O'Malley has explained your situation in his letter. Abandonment under life-threatening circumstances is indeed grounds for divorce in this territory. How long would the process take? Willow asked. Ordinarily, several months at minimum, Hargrove replied. However, your case has certain, compelling elements that might expedite matters. He shuffled through some papers on his desk. I've taken the liberty of making inquiries. Your husband has made quite a name for himself in Virginia City, not a favorable one, I might add. What do you mean? Yates asked. Mr. Kensington has accumulated significant gambling debts, Hargrove explained. He's also been boasting publicly about, forgive me, Mrs. Kensington, getting rid of his nagging wife. Several witnesses have signed statements to this effect. Willow flinched at the callous characterization, but Yates's hand covering hers steadied her. Furthermore, Hargrove continued, I've obtained a statement from the Hendersons confirming they saw him leaving your homestead with what appeared to be all your provisions, and that he lied about your whereabouts. He looked up at them over his spectacles. In short, we have an excellent case not just for divorce but for criminal abandonment. I don't want him arrested, Willow said quickly. I just want to be free of him legally and completely. Hargrove nodded. That can be arranged. In fact, I believe we can convince a judge to grant an expedited divorce on the grounds of abandonment and cruelty. It would help if you could provide a deposition detailing exactly what happened when he left. I can do that, Willow confirmed. Excellent. And Mr. O'Malley, your testimony regarding the condition in which you found Mrs. Kensington will be valuable as well. They spent the next hour providing detailed statements, which Hargrove's clerk carefully recorded. By the end, Hargrove seemed confident. I'll present this petition to Judge Wilson this afternoon, he said. He's a fair-minded man who takes a dim view of men who abandon their responsibilities. With luck, we might have a ruling within days rather than months. As they left the lawyer's office, Willow felt lighter than she had in months. The prospect of legal freedom, of being able to move forward with Yates without shadows from the past, seemed suddenly within reach. They spent the next few days exploring Helena while awaiting news from Hargrove. Yates showed Willow the sights of the growing town, the new territorial capital building, the bustling marketplace, the surprisingly sophisticated restaurants and shops that catered to the area's successful miners and businessmen. On their third evening in town, Yates surprised Willow by suggesting dinner at the Grand Hotel, Helena's finest establishment. When she met him in the lobby, she found him dressed in new clothes, a proper suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and height. You look very handsome, she said, genuinely impressed by his transformation from trail-worn cowboy to distinguished gentleman. And you're beautiful, he replied, his eyes appreciative as he took in her appearance. Willow had splurged on a new dress, a deep blue that complemented her eyes and showed off her figure to advantage. The dining room of the Grand Hotel was elegant by frontier standards, with white tablecloths, crystal glassware, and a small orchestra playing in the corner. As they were seated at a table near the window, Willow couldn't help but compare this evening to her last formal dinner with Frank, when he had spent the entire meal talking about himself and his plans, barely acknowledging her presence. Yates, in contrast, was attentive and engaging, asking about her impressions of Helena, sharing amusing observations about the other diners, and generally making her feel like the center of his world. After they had ordered, Yates reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. I know we agreed to wait until everything was legally resolved, he said, sliding the box across the table to her. And I'm still holding to that. But I saw this today and thought of you. Willow opened the box to find a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a willow tree, its branches etched with remarkable detail, hanging from a fine silver chain. "Yates, it's beautiful," she breathed, lifting the necklace from its box. "May I?" he asked, rising to help her put it on. His fingers brushed the nape of her neck as he fastened the clasp, sending a pleasant shiver down her spine. When he returned to his seat, his eyes lingered on the pendant resting against her collarbone. "Perfect," he said softly. The evening passed in a warm glow of good food, pleasant music, and meaningful conversation. By the time they returned to the hotel, Willow was certain that regardless of legal documents or social conventions, she had found her true partner in Yates O'Malley. The following morning brought news from Hargrove. Judge Wilson had reviewed their petition and, impressed by the evidence of Frank's abandonment and subsequent behavior, had agreed to an expedited hearing the next day. "This is unusual," Hargrove explained when they met in his office. But the judge was particularly moved by the life-threatening nature of the abandonment and by Mr. O'Malley's intervention. He said, and I quote, "True decency should be rewarded, and true villainy punished." The hearing itself was brief but emotional. Willow stood before Judge Wilson, a stern but fair-looking man with a substantial white beard, and recounted the day Frank had left with their provisions. Yates testified about finding her alone and nearly out of food as winter set in. The Hendersons, who had traveled to Helena specifically for the hearing, confirmed Frank's lies and their own observations of Willow's dire situation. When all testimony had been given, Judge Wilson cleared his throat and addressed the court. "In my years on the bench, I have seen many cases of marital discord and dissolution," he began. "But rarely have I encountered such a clear example of abandonment and betrayal of the marriage covenant. Frank Kensington not only deserted his wife, but did so in a manner that placed her life in direct peril." He looked directly at Willow. "Mrs. Kensington, this court finds that you have been grievously wronged and are entitled to complete dissolution of your marriage on the grounds of abandonment, cruelty, and breach of marital duty." He struck his gavel decisively. "The divorce is granted, effective immediately. Furthermore, Mrs. Kensington is awarded full ownership of the homestead property and any remaining possessions therein. Mr. Kensington's rights to said property are hereby terminated." Tears of relief and vindication filled Willow's eyes. She was free truly, legally free to build a new life without Frank's shadow hanging over her. Outside the courthouse, Yates took her hands in his expression serious despite the joy of the moment. "I want to do this properly," he said. "Now that you're free, will you allow me to court you, Willow? Not rushed, not born of necessity, but a proper courtship." His formality made her smile. After all they had shared during the long winter, the hardships, the confidences, the growing love, a traditional courtship seemed almost quaint. But she understood his intention and appreciated the respect it demonstrated. "Yes, Yates O'Malley," she replied. "I would be honored to be courted by you." Their courtship, while proper in its outward form, was built on the deep foundation of trust and love they had already established. They returned to the homestead, which was truly Willow's now by legal decree, but maintained separate living quarters as before. Yates continued to sleep in the barn room, though they spent their days together working the land, preparing for the growing season and making plans for the future. Word of Willow's divorce and the circumstances surrounding it spread through the scattered community. Rather than facing censure, she found herself the recipient of sympathy and support. The story of her abandonment and rescue had captured the imagination of their neighbors, and Yates was regarded with respect bordering on admiration for his honorable actions. Spring advanced rapidly, transforming the landscape with fresh green growth and wildflowers. Willow's garden flourished under her care, promising abundant vegetables for the coming months. Yates added to their livestock, purchasing 2 milk cows and additional chickens from a settler who was moving on to Oregon. Through it all, their love deepened and matured. The passion they had carefully restrained during winter found expression in increasingly frequent kisses and embraces, though both remained committed to waiting for marriage before taking the final step in their relationship. 6 weeks after the divorce was granted, on a perfect June day with the mountains standing clear against a blue sky, Yates took Willow riding to the valley he had told her about during the winter, the place he had dreamed of building his own ranch. The valley was even more beautiful than he had described, a wide expanse of lush grass bordered by pine forests, with a clear stream running through its center and mountains providing shelter on 3 sides. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in purple, yellow, and white, and birds sang from every tree. They stopped at a high point overlooking the valley, dismounting to enjoy the view. Yates spread a blanket on the grass, and they shared the picnic lunch Willow had prepared. "What do you think?" Yates asked, his arm around her as they gazed at the valley below. "Could you see yourself building a life here?" "It's beautiful," Willow replied honestly. "More beautiful than I imagined." "I've put in a claim for the land," Yates said, a note of pride in his voice. 500 acres, including this overlook and the stream. The paperwork came through yesterday. Willow turned to him in surprise. "You didn't tell me." "I wanted it to be a surprise." He shifted to face her directly, taking both her hands in his. "Willow, I brought you here today for a reason." Her heart began to race as he reached into his pocket and produced a small ring, a simple gold band set with a single pearl. "I love you," Yates said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've loved you since that winter night when you stood on your porch with a poker in your hand, determined to face whatever came your way. I love your courage, your kindness, your strength." He held up the ring. "This isn't fancy, but it's real, like what I feel for you. Willow Kensington, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me in this valley?" Tears of joy filled Willow's eyes. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, Yates O'Malley, I will marry you and build a life with you. I love you with all my heart." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and sealed their engagement with a kiss, Willow felt a sense of rightness, of completion. The journey that had begun with betrayal and the threat of death had led her to this moment of perfect happiness, to this man who had proven his love not with grand gestures but with consistent care and unwavering support. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Helena, with the Hendersons and several other neighbors in attendance. Willow wore a dress of pale blue silk, an extravagance Yates had insisted upon, and carried wildflowers gathered from their valley that morning. Yates, handsome in a new suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle toward him. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful. When they exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other for all their days, both had tears in their eyes, knowing how close they had come to never finding each other at all. That evening they returned to the homestead as husband and wife. For the first time, Yates carried his belongings from the barn room into the main cabin, into the bedroom that was now theirs to share. Their wedding night was everything Willow had hoped for: tender, passionate, a perfect expression of the love that had grown between them through hardship and joy alike. As summer progressed, they divided their time between the existing homestead and their new land in the valley. They began construction on a house larger and more carefully planned than the cabin, with room for the family they hoped to create. Neighbors helped with the building, a tradition of the frontier that strengthened community bonds. By the time autumn painted the landscape in gold and crimson, the house was nearly complete. Their first Christmas as a married couple found them in their new home in the valley. A pine tree stood in the corner, decorated much like the one Yates had brought to the cabin during that first winter. But this tree was surrounded by evidence of their prosperity, comfortable furniture, well-stocked shelves, the beginnings of a library filled with the books Willow loved. As they sat by the fire that Christmas Eve, Willow had a special gift for Yates. Taking his hand, she placed it gently on her stomach. "Next Christmas," she said softly, "there will be 3 of us." The joy that spread across Yates's face was a gift in itself. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "I love you, Willow O'Malley," he whispered against her hair. "And I love you," she replied, secure in the knowledge that the man who had once promised to feed her till spring had given her something far more valuable, a lifetime of love, respect, and partnership. Their daughter was born the following summer, a strong, healthy girl with her mother's eyes and her father's determined chin. They named her Hope, a testament to what had sustained them through that first difficult winter and the brighter seasons that followed. As the years passed, their ranch prospered. They added to their herd of cattle, built additional outbuildings, and expanded their home as their family grew to include 2 more children, a boy and another girl. Willow began writing down the stories she had always created in her mind, finding unexpected success when her tales of frontier life were published in Eastern magazines. They never heard from Frank again, though occasionally travelers would bring rumors he had moved to California, had lost everything in a card game, had tried his luck in the Alaska gold fields. These stories held no power over Willow anymore. She had long since stopped thinking of herself as the abandoned wife and embraced her identity as Willow O'Malley, respected rancher's wife, mother, and increasingly author. On the 10th anniversary of the day Yates had ridden up to her cabin and promised to feed her till spring, they stood together on the overlook where he had proposed, watching the sun set over their valley. Their children played nearby, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "Did you ever imagine this?" Willow asked, leaning against her husband's solid strength. "That day when you found me alone in that cabin?" Yates considered the question, his arm tightening around her waist. "Not specifically this," he admitted. "But I knew from that first moment that you were special, that helping you wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the only thing I could do." "You saved my life," Willow said softly. "And you saved mine," Yates replied, turning to face her. "I was just existing before I found you, Willow. Moving from job to job, place to place, never putting down roots. You gave me purpose, a reason to build something lasting." As the last rays of sunlight gilded the valley that had become their home, Willow reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. Frank's betrayal, which had seemed like the end of everything, had actually been the beginning of a far richer life than she could have imagined. "No matter what happens," she said, looking up at the man who had kept his promise and so much more, "I will always be grateful that you rode up to my cabin that day, that you saw a woman in need and chose to help." "And I'll always be grateful," Yates replied, bending to kiss her with the same tenderness he had shown from the beginning, "that you were brave enough to trust again, to build a new life with me." Together they watched darkness settle over their valley, secure in the knowledge that whatever the future might hold, they would face it as they had faced everything since that first winter, side by side, partners in the truest sense of the word. And when their grandchildren asked years later how their grandmother and grandfather had met, they would hear the story that had become something of a legend in those parts of how her husband rode away with their food, and a cowboy said, "Then I'll feed you till spring."